Now let's review the process for transferring a patient from the in-house to another facility, or interfacility transfer. As we've already reviewed in the discharge process as well as the in-house transfer process, it's necessary to ensure that you review each of the care sets prior to closing out their documentation to ensure that any last-minute documentation is complete. One at a time, review each care set, open the care set, and document additional comments as needed. Following that, go to your flow sheets and ensure that you've finished all of your documentation for each of the flow sheets assigned to the care sets. Once you've documented on your flow sheets, you want to ensure that the statuses continue to reflect the patient's current state of condition. For example, discharging a patient, we would change the status to discharged for each care set. Conversely, when transferring a patient from our hospital to another facility, like a SNF, it's important to continue to reflect the patient's current status so that nursing care continues based on the patient's current condition. Therefore, any care sets that are still active should be stated as active. Any care sets that you feel can be resolved prior to transferring the patient should be changed to resolved, and likewise for inactive. Additionally, the physical therapy discharge summary should also be documented if the patient's going to require continued physical therapy at their receiving facility. Interdisciplinary patient education is always important to verify prior to transferring the patient. And then finally, completion of the patient's discharge summary. Opening the unit standards tree by clicking the plus symbol and scrolling down, you can locate the patient's discharge summary flow sheet. Selecting the discharge summary flow sheet, it's important to chart where the patient's being transferred to by charting New. Time and date stamp for the time the patient is transferring, select their location, opening the fields, and identifying the actual name of the facility. Identify how the patient is transferred, as well as who's accompanying the patient, who received the documents, and the name of the nurse that you called and gave report to. Include vaccination documentation, belongings, and anything from the safe. Finally, indicate the patient's understanding of their discharge instructions or transfer instructions, and that copies were sent to the facility. And then lastly, the time at which the patient is to be picked up. Chart and exit. Through the tutorial, we've reviewed the process for performing an in-house transfer, a discharge, and an inter-facility transfer. We'll conclude the module by discussing the electronic medical records that are necessary for printing for each of those processes. Printing the electronic medical records should always be performed using the Patient Reports tab of the Navigator. Select Patient Reports, and we'll begin to review the electronic medical records that should be printed when performing an in-house transfer or from one unit to the next. Simply identify in the drop-down menu the Clinical Chart tab. From Admit to Current Date, select Show the Report. From the report view, we can print the report and send the report with the patient. This process is particularly important during the first week of Go Live, when not all units will have the ability to retrieve information from the electronic medical record on a transfer. It may also be necessary to print the clinical chart during times of scheduled downtime. For example, when the IS department is going to perform an update to the MS4 clinical suite, it may be necessary to ensure that certain documents are printed prior to going down. In this instance, for example, you may want to only print a certain time frame of documents. For example, by selecting in the last 1 to 2 to 4 hours or beyond, the flow sheets or the clinical chart and flow sheets necessary for viewing for that patient. To discharge a patient, you would provide the patient with their prescriptions, their medication reconciliation and discharge instructions, and any patient education materials requested by the physician and or nursing care that's required, and discharge the patient as normal. You do not need to print the discharge summary from the electronic medical record. For an interfacility transfer, it's necessary that certain documents follow the patient. As usual, the unit secretary will be printing copies of the full chart. Copies of the chart can be obtained from the Clinical Chart drop-down menu. In addition, you'll need to print the last 48 hours of nursing assessments. Coming to the nursing assessment history, selecting the time frame for the previous 48 hours by moving your clock back, clicking the Search tab allows you to pull up a list of all of the flow sheets available for print. Simply select the Select All tab, click Show Report, and then print the information from the print screen.